A widow with two half-frozen children stood in a Montana snowstorm, pounding on the door of the one man the whole valley swore would put her in the ground for it. When the giant of Beckett's Hollow finally opened that door, his answer left her unable to speak a single word. Listen close. They still tell this one in the Bitterroot, and they swear it's true as the cold. The winter of 1879 came down on the Bitterroot Range like a judgment. It came early and it came mean, a wall of gray sky that rolled over the peaks in October and never lifted. The river that ran the length of the valley swelled with the first storms, then froze solid in a single night, trapping a drowned cottonwood in the ice with its branches reaching up like a hand. Folks said you could hear the trees crack in the dark, sharp as rifle shots. It was no country for the soft and no country for the slow, and that autumn it had grown crueler still, because a man named Cyrus Vane had spent 2 years buying it out from under the people who farmed it. High above the valley floor, pinned in a notch of black timber where the wind never stopped talking, was a place the town called Beckett's Hollow, and in it lived Amos Beckett. He stood near a head taller than any man in the territory, broad as a barn door, with a beard gone iron gray and a pair of hands that looked like they could close around a fence post and snap it. He kept to himself up there in a long, low cabin of squared logs, and the town below kept its stories. They said he'd killed men with those hands. They said he buried trespassers under his woodpile, and that the reason no snow ever seemed to settle on that ground was the warmth of what lay beneath it. Mothers used his name to frighten children. Men crossed the river rather than ride past his trail. Nobody knocked on that door. Nobody ever had. That was the door Clara Mercer chose, because every other door in the world had already shut. She'd been a homesteader's wife once, with a sod roof and a milk cow and a husband named Tom who coughed through one bad winter and didn't see the spring. Then the papers came. A man in a clean black coat rode out with a sheriff and a stack of documents and read off a debt her Tom had never owed, a mortgage signed in an ink that wasn't his, and they put her and her 2 children out on the road with a wagon and one tired mare. By the time the mare gave out at the foot of the Bitterroot, the wagon was gone, the last of the flour was gone, and Clara was carrying her 4-year-old daughter Lottie against her chest, while her 9-year-old son Samuel walked beside her with his jaw set hard so she wouldn't see it tremble. She'd gone into the trading post at the bottom of the valley to beg a night by the stove. They wouldn't have her. Times were lean and Vane's men watched who took in strays. An old trapper by the fire took pity enough to talk, and what he told her was this. There was one place left that no debt collector would follow her to, one trail no posse would climb. Up the timber in the hollow where the killer lived. He'd sooner die in the open than send a woman up there, the trapper said, but he told her the way. So she climbed. The snow came down sideways and the dark came down with it, and Lottie had gone quiet against her in a way that frightened Clara more than any crying could, and Samuel stumbled and got up and stumbled and got up without a word. When at last the low shape of the cabin loomed out of the white, Clara could no longer feel her own feet. She crossed the dead quiet ground where no snow lay, and she beat her bleeding hand against the heavy door, and she had just enough breath left to say the only thing she had to offer. Please, one night, just one night for my children. I can pay with nothing, but I'm asking anyway. For a long moment there was only the wind. Then the bolt drew back with a sound like a bone settling, and the door swung in, and he filled the whole frame of it, a giant lit orange from the fire behind him, looking down at the smallest, most ruined thing the mountain had ever delivered to his step. Clara braced for the worst. She had heard every story. She held her daughter tighter, and she did not look away from him, because she had decided on the climb that if she was going to die, she would die looking a man in the eye. What Amos Beckett did was step back out of the doorway. "You'll let the heat out," he said, in a voice like gravel rolling in a barrel. "Bring them in by the fire. Mind the dog, he's old and he's stupid, but he won't bite." That was his response. That was the answer the whole valley had sworn would never come. Clara stood frozen a beat longer, certain she'd misheard, and the giant reached past her into the dark, scooped Samuel up under one arm like a sack of meal, and held the door for her with the other. She carried Lottie across the threshold on legs that no longer obeyed her, and she could not, for the life of her, find a single word to say. Inside, the cabin was warm and it smelled of wood smoke and tanned hide and something herbal drying in bunches from the rafters. There was no woodpile of bodies. There was a stone hearth banked high, a long table, a wall hung not with scalps but with rolled papers and a pair of brass instruments she didn't have names for. The old dog lifted its gray muzzle from the hearthstone, decided they weren't worth getting up for, and went back to sleep. Amos set Samuel down on a bearskin near the fire and turned his attention to the children with a focus that brooked no argument. Wet things off, all of it. Wet wool will kill them surer than the cold will. He pulled a folded quilt from a chest and pushed it at Clara. Wrap the little one. Rub her hands and her feet, not too rough, get the blood moving. He swung an iron kettle over the flames, dropped in dried venison and a fistful of roots, and within minutes the cabin filled with the smell of broth. When Lottie's lips finally pinked and she began weakly to cry, the big man let out a breath like a man hearing good news. "Crying's good," he said. "Crying means she's thawing." Only when both children were bundled and fed did he turn to Clara, who was still in her soaked dress, swaying, her frostbitten hands bleeding fresh. He held out a heavy flannel shirt the size of a tent and a wool blanket and then turned his broad back to the room. "Put that on. I won't look." She heard her own voice come back to her at last, small and cracked. "My name is Clara, Clara Mercer. This is Samuel and the little one's Lottie." When he said nothing, she added, because it seemed important, "You saved our lives, Mr. Beckett." "Storm's not done," Amos said to the fire. "And a woman doesn't climb a killer's mountain in a freeze to get away from weather. The cold's not the worst thing that came up this trail tonight." He paused. "We'll talk on it in the morning. Sleep." She slept like the dead, and so did her children. And for the first night in 3 weeks, none of them woke. She woke to the soft sound of a child laughing, which was a sound she had been afraid she'd never hear again. Clara sat up under the quilts to find Samuel and Lottie sitting cross-legged on the bearskin, while the giant of Beckett's Hollow knelt in front of them, a block of pale wood in one massive hand and a bowie knife the length of her forearm in the other, peeling off curls of shaving with a delicacy that didn't belong to hands that size. He was making something. As she watched, the rough block became the arched neck of a little horse, and he handed it to Lottie without ceremony. The girl turned it over, beaming, and then she did a thing that made Clara's breath catch. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed bundle, produced a pinecone she'd somehow carried up the entire mountain, and held it out to the man in both hands. "For you," Lottie said. "For the horse." Amos looked at the pinecone like it was a live coal. Then he took it, gruff as ever, and pushed it into the breast pocket of his shirt. "Obliged," he muttered, and went back to his whittling, and Samuel laughed again. Clara made herself useful. She found the broth still warm, and she found a rag and began on the breakfast dishes, and over the clatter of it the big man finally spoke, not turning around. "Who took your home, Mrs. Mercer?" It wasn't a question, not really. She set down the cup in her hands. "A debt my husband never owed," she said. "A mortgage with his name on it, signed in an ink that wasn't his, and a sheriff who wouldn't look at me when he read it out." She heard the bitterness climb into her voice, and she let it. "We're not the only ones. Half the valley's been read off their land the same way this past 2 years. There's widows of mine sleeping in barns from here to the territorial line. The man who does it rides out clean and lets his collector do the dirty part." She swallowed. "His name is Cyrus Vane." The name dropped into the warm cabin like a stone into a still pool. Amos Beckett went completely, unnervingly still. The knife stopped. The old dog lifted its head and looked at its master and then put it back down. "Vane," Amos repeated, and his voice had dropped to something low and vibrating, a sound that lived under the floor of words. "And the collector, tall man, talks soft, carries a quirt he doesn't use on horses." Clara stared at him. "You know Lyle Doggett." "I know Lyle Doggett." He set the little wooden horse on the table with great care. He laid the knife beside it. And then the giant of Beckett's Hollow told her a thing the valley below had never once guessed about the killer in the timber. "I'm no murderer, Mrs. Mercer, whatever they say down the mountain. I let them say it. Keeps the curious off my trail." He turned, and for the first time she saw his face full in the firelight, and what she saw there was not menace. It was grief, old and worn smooth as river stone. "I was a surveyor, a territorial man, sworn and bonded. 5 years back I walked every claim line in this valley with a chain and a transit, and I set the corners honest, everyone, and I filed the true book of it with the land office in Helena, section by section, whose ground was whose, marked and witnessed and signed." His jaw worked. Vane came after. He couldn't buy the valley honest because the valley was honestly owned and the record proved it. So he made his own record, forged the field notes, paid a clerk, burned what he could of the truth. He stopped. "He sent men to my camp to burn the rest. My wife was in the wagon, my boy. I was up on the ridge resetting a corner that had shifted, and I came down to ash." The cabin was very quiet. Outside the wind had eased, and the snow had gone to a soft falling. "I buried what there was to bury," Amos said. "I came up here to be a ghost, but I didn't come empty-handed." He crossed to the wall hung with rolled papers and laid his great hand flat against them. "The original field book, my own copy, witnessed and dated, with the office seal on it from before Vane ever touched a thing. He thinks he burned every true map in the territory. He burned every one but mine." He looked at her. "You didn't bring trouble to my door, Mrs. Mercer. You brought me the reason to open it." She didn't have words for that either. She was getting used to not having words in this cabin. The third storm broke on the fourth morning, and it broke into a hard, bright silence, the valley buried and blinding under new snow. And into that silence, near midday, came the sound of horses on the trail. Amos heard it first. He went to the wall, slid a board aside, and put his eye to the gap. 4 riders, climbing single file, the lead man tall and easy in the saddle with a coiled quirt at his hip. Amos's mouth thinned. "Doggett," he said. "He's quicker than I gave him credit for. Followed your boy's footprints up before the snow filled them." He took a long rifle down from its pegs and pressed a heavy revolver into Clara's hands, closing her fingers over the grip. "You don't fire this at a man unless a man is coming through that door, and it isn't me. You understand? You point it at the door and you don't think about it. You've got 2 reasons sitting by that fire." Clara looked at her children, then at the cold weight in her hands. "I've never shot at a person." "You won't have to think about it when the time comes," Amos said. "That's the mercy and the curse of it both." He set his hand on the bolt. "Stay inside. Whatever you hear, you keep that door shut till I say." He stepped out onto the porch into the murderous glare, the rifle held low and easy, and he stood there like part of the mountain. Down in the snow, the 4 riders reined up. Doggett pushed his hat back with one finger and smiled, soft and slow. "Beckett," Doggett said, "heard you was dead, heard a lot of things." He let the quirt swing. "Got a runaway deader up here. Woman, 2 whelps. Mr. Vane wants what's owed, and I aim to bring it down. You hand her over, I forget I climbed your hill. We been neighbors a long time, you and me." "We were never neighbors," Amos said. His voice carried flat and cold across the snow. "You burned my camp, you held the lamp." Doggett's smile didn't move. "Old news, ash and old news. You're one man, Beckett, gone soft, hiding in the rocks, mourning a wife 5 years in the ground." He never finished it. Amos didn't shout and he didn't waste a word. He brought the rifle up in one smooth motion and put a round through the air a hand's width over Doggett's hat. So close the man's horse screamed and reared, and then the porch was a blur. A second rider clawed for his pistol, and Amos shot it out of his hand, fingers and all, and the man howled and clutched his ruined hand to his chest. The third spurred forward, firing wild, splinters jumping from the porch posts, and Amos was already moving. Dropping behind the stacked cordwood, drawing a heavy revolver, and his shots were not wild. He shot the third man's horse out from under him into a drift, and the man went down hard and stayed down, dazed and disarmed in the snow. Inside, Clara heard boots on the porch boards. The fourth rider had circled wide while the others drew the giant's eye, and now he kicked the cabin door open and stood there in the gap with a grin and a pistol, and he saw a woman and two children and he relaxed. He should not have relaxed. Clara Mercer had buried a husband and lost a home and carried her daughter up a killing mountain, and she did not scream and she did not freeze. She raised the heavy revolver in both hands the way she'd been told, pointed it at the door and squeezed. The gun bucked and roared and bit her palms, and the man stumbled backward off the porch and into the snow with the grin wiped clean off his face, alive but folded over and done fighting. And Clara stood there shaking with the smoke curling up between her and the open door. Out front, Amos rose from behind the cordwood. Doggett had got his horse back under him and seen his men ruined around him, one bleeding, two down, the woman's shot ringing from inside the cabin, and the soft smile was gone from his face entirely. "This ain't finished," Doggett spat, hauling his horse around. "Vane's coming up himself. He's bringing the marshal, his marshal, the one he pays. They'll burn you out of this rock and call it the law." He put his spurs in and went crashing down the trail, with what was left of his men dragging after. The silence rushed back. Amos walked to each downed man, took their guns, looked them over with the cold eye of a man who'd patched wounds in the wild before and judged none of them dying. He came back inside and found Clara still standing, the revolver hanging now from one hand, her face white. Gently, the way he'd handled the wood, he took the gun from her. "You held the door," he said. "That's all I asked." For just a moment his great hand closed over hers where it had gone cold around nothing, and something passed between them that neither would have named, and Lottie, bless her, chose that moment to come pad across the floor and press a smooth gray river stone into the big man's other hand. He looked at it and at the woman, and he put the stone in his pocket with the pinecone, and he said, gruff, "Obliged," and Clara surprised herself by laughing just once on the edge of tears. "They're coming back," she said, "with the law." "With Vane's law," Amos said, "not the real kind." He crossed again to the wall of papers and laid his hand on the rolled field book, and a different look came into his eyes, not the cold of the porch, but something steadier. "Here's what they don't understand, Mrs. Mercer. A man like Vane wins by being the only one holding the paper. Burn every honest map and the lie becomes the truth, because there's nothing left to set against it." He drew the field book down and held it, this heavy roll of witnessed and sealed survey, the only true record of who owned the Bitterroot. "But I'm still holding mine, and I am done being a ghost." She thought he meant a gun. She was wrong, and that was the part of the story the valley remembered longest. Amos Beckett did not lay a trap of dynamite. He did not go down the mountain to kill. He went down to be seen. He waited 2 days for the trail to firm, and then he hitched his old mule and rode down out of the timber for the first time in 5 years, with Clara beside him and the children bundled in the cart, and the rolled field book wrapped in oilcloth across his knees. And he did not go to meet Vane on a lonely road where men could disappear. He went to the river crossing below the trading post, the one wide flat where the whole valley had to pass, where the trapped cottonwood reached its frozen hand out of the ice, and there he stopped, in the open, in front of every soul who came and went. Word ran ahead of him faster than he rode. The dead man of Beckett's Hollow was down off his mountain, and he was knocking on doors. He knocked on the doors of the widows, the ones read off their land same as Clara, sleeping in barns and lean-tos along the line. He found a dozen of them, and he told them, plain, what he had and what it meant, and one by one they came down to the crossing. He knocked on the doors of the men who still had ground and feared they'd lose it next, and they came too, slow at first and then quicker, because a man who has been afraid a long time will follow anyone willing to stand up first. By the third morning, there was a crowd at the river crossing that had not gathered in that valley in 2 years, and at the center of it stood the giant they had all been raised to fear, holding a roll of oilcloth. Cyrus Vane came down the road in a fine black sleigh with a buffalo robe across his knees, and the bought marshal riding at his side, and Lyle Doggett trailing with the bandaged remnants of his men. He was a smooth, pale man with soft hands and a cattleman's hat he hadn't earned, and he stopped his sleigh at the edge of the crowd and looked it over with mild distaste, the way a man looks at mud on a clean floor. "Marshal," Vane said, "I'm told there's a fugitive here, a debtor, and a hermit interfering with the lawful collection of debts." He still hadn't looked at Amos directly. "Clear them off." "My name," said Amos Beckett, and the crowd went quiet, "is Amos Beckett, territorial surveyor, bonded and sworn, license number on file in Helena. I walked these lines 5 years past. I set every corner in this valley, and I filed the true book of it before you ever rode in Vane. You remember. You sent Doggett to burn it. You burned my camp. You burned my wife and my son in their wagon, and you missed one thing." He held the oilcloth up over his head so every soul at the crossing could see it. "You missed this, the original field notes, witnessed, sealed, dated 3 months before the first paper you ever forged. Every claim in this valley marked honest in a record that predates every lie you wrote." He turned slowly to the bought marshal. "You read these widows off their land on Vane's paper. Set Vane's paper against this in any honest court in the territory, and tell these people which one a judge believes." For the first time, Cyrus Vane looked at him, and the color went out of the smooth, pale face, because Vane was a man who understood paper better than anyone, and he understood in an instant that he was beaten by it. The marshal beside him was already easing his horse a half-step away, the way a man steps back from something about to fall. The crowd had begun to murmur, and the murmur had teeth in it. A dozen wronged widows and the men who'd feared they were next, and they were looking at Vane now and not at the giant. "Doggett," Vane said low, "take it from him." But Lyle Doggett looked at the crowd, and looked at the marshal who would not meet his eye, and looked at the bandaged ruin of the men he had left, and something in him made the only smart calculation it had ever made. "Take it yourself," Doggett said, and turned his horse out of the line. The hold a man like Vane keeps over men like Doggett is only ever fear and money, and at the river crossing that morning in front of everyone, both of them ran dry at once. It didn't end in a gunfight. The valley wouldn't let it. The bought marshal, with a dozen witnesses watching and the real record held up in a giant's hand, did the cowardly arithmetic of his kind and decided his career was worth more than Cyrus Vane, and he was the one who finally said the words, loud enough for the crowd. The claims were in dispute. The matter would go to Helena. No one else would be put off their land. It was not justice, not yet, not the whole of it. But it was the first true thing the law had said in that valley in 2 years, and the widows wept to hear it. And Vane sat in his fine black sleigh with his ruin settling over him like the snow, broken not by a bullet, but by the one weapon he'd been sure he'd burned. He left the territory before the spring court ever sat. Men like Vane do not stay to watch the paper turn against them. Doggett drifted off down the line and was not heard of again. And the field book of Amos Beckett went to Helena under seal. And one by one through that long winter and the green spring that followed, the honest corners he had set 5 years before were found again under the snow exactly where he had driven them, and the valley was given back to the people who had broken their backs on it. Clara Mercer got her homestead back. The sod roof, the patched fence, the ground where Tom was buried. But by the time the deed came back into her hands, she found she could not picture living on it alone, and she did not have to wonder long whether the giant of the hollow felt the same, because he had taken to mending her fence before she'd asked, and sitting longer at her table than the coffee required. They did not make a speech of it. That wasn't either of their ways. One evening at the start of the thaw, she walked up to him at her own gate and reached up and laid her hand against his scarred cheek, the way she'd wanted to since the morning she watched him whittle a horse for a frightened child, and he rested his great hand over hers and leaned into it, and that was the whole of the asking and the whole of the answer. It was Samuel who found the shelf, the day they moved Amos's few things down from the hollow. By the cabin door, on a plank worn smooth, there was a row of small treasures laid out careful as a museum. Every pinecone, every river stone, a jay's blue feather, a bit of quartz, a dozen small, useless, precious things, each one pressed into a giant's hand by a 4-year-old who had decided on the worst night of her life that the scariest man in the valley needed a present. He had kept every single one. "You kept them," Clara said from the doorway. Amos Beckett, surveyor ghost, the killer who never killed a soul, looked at the shelf and at the children and at the woman who had knocked on the one door that opened. "Course I kept them," he said, gruff as the first night. "A man keeps what's given freely. There's not much of it in this world." And he picked up Lottie, who was reaching for the feather, and set her on his shoulder where she could see the whole valley laid out below them, green and free and given back. And he carried her down the mountain into the living world he had been so long a stranger to. And that's the tale they still tell in the Bitterroot. A homeless mother climbed a killing mountain to knock on a murderer's door, and the murderer turned out to be the only honest man left in the valley. And the one door in the world that everyone swore would never open was the door that opened wide. What an extraordinary story of mercy, of courage, and of a sanctuary given freely to a stranger in the cold. If this frontier tale of redemption moved you, give that like button a press and share it with someone who needs reminding that the world can still surprise you. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories of the Old West. And tell me down in the comments, if every other door had shut, would you have had the courage to climb that mountain and knock?